Lake Success, New York, 1994. A federal courtroom on Long Island. The defendant is not famous. His name has appeared in newspapers, but rarely on front pages. He is 65 years old. He is wearing a suit that does not fit him well. He has spent the last 3 years in protective custody. He stands when the prosecutor calls his name. He raises his right hand, and he begins to dismantle, from memory, the structure he spent 4 decades building. The Lucchese crime family had 5 boroughs of New York and a corridor of New Jersey that produced more revenue, year over year, than any other faction in the 5 families. The man taking the oath had run that corridor for almost 20 years. He had survived the longest criminal trial in New Jersey history. He had walked out of a Newark courtroom in 1988 acquitted on all counts. What follows is not the story of a famous gangster. It is the story of the man no one was supposed to remember. The one who ran the most profitable arm of an American crime family from a strip mall office in suburban New Jersey, and whose name, even now, does not appear on most lists of the men who mattered. This account is drawn from federal trial transcripts, sworn testimony, declassified FBI surveillance files, and reporting in the New York Times, the Star-Ledger, and the Asbury Park Press. Some details remain contested. Some witnesses contradicted each other under oath. Where the record is incomplete, that absence is noted. The story begins not with a killing. It begins with a question that took the federal government almost 2 decades to answer. Who was actually running New Jersey? Lake Success, New York, 1994. A federal courtroom, wood paneling, fluorescent light, the kind of room designed to absorb attention rather than focus it. The defendant rises. He is 65 years old. His hair has gone almost entirely white. He has the build of a man who once worked with his hands and has not for a long time. The prosecutor reads his name into the record. Anthony Accetturo, known on the street as Tumac, former capo and de facto boss of the New Jersey faction of the Lucchese crime family. He raises his right hand. He swears to tell the truth. Then he begins to speak. What he describes over the course of weeks of testimony is not the cinematic mafia of the public imagination. It is a logistics operation. A management structure, a pyramid of earners and tribute payments, a bureaucracy that happened to be illegal. He names men he had known for 30 years. He names the men who tried to kill him. He names himself. For most of the public, the Lucchese family meant Manhattan, the Bronx, the Garment District, the names that surfaced in tabloid headlines. But the money, the real money, year over year, decade over decade, did not come from Manhattan. It came from the Garden State, from cargo theft at Newark Airport, from video poker machines in roadside bars, from the construction sites along the Garden State Parkway, from the gambling networks that ran through Livingston, Florham Park, and the long industrial spine of Essex County. And the man who ran all of it was almost never photographed. Federal agents who tracked him for 15 years described him in internal memos as, quote, disciplined, deliberate, and exceptionally cautious, end quote. He did not give interviews. He did not appear at the Ravenite Social Club. He did not court reporters. He ran New Jersey from a strip mall. Anthony Accetturo was born in 1938 in Orange, New Jersey. His family was Italian-American, working class, the kind of immigrant household that arrived in the United States with nothing and built upward in increments. He left school in the 9th grade. By the time he was 20, he was working as a low-level enforcer for a Newark loan shark named Anthony Boy Boyardo, a soldier in what was then known as the De Cavalcante faction, but operated, in practice, in the orbit of the Lucchese family. The story is familiar from 1,000 other Mafia biographies. What is less familiar is what came next. By the mid-1960s, Accetturo had been formally inducted into the Lucchese family. By the early 1970s, he had been promoted to capo. And by 1976, The family's leadership in Manhattan had given him something almost no other capo in the 5 families ever received: operational autonomy. The Jersey crew was his. He would run it without daily supervision from New York. He would manage its earners directly. He would handle its disputes internally. He would only answer upward when a percentage of the take needed to be delivered. In the language of the family, he was a capo. In practice, he was a regional boss. The question of why the Manhattan administration gave Accetturo this kind of authority is even now not fully settled. Some former federal investigators who reviewed the period later described the arrangement as a deliberate experiment. The Lucchese family had been weakened by the prosecutions of the early 1970s. The leadership wanted earners. They wanted a stable, productive arm of the organization that did not require constant management. Other accounts suggest the answer was simpler. Accetturo was producing. The tribute payments arriving from New Jersey were larger than from any other crew. As long as the money flowed upward, the structure above him did not interfere. The historical record does not fully resolve the question. What is documented in FBI surveillance reports and later in sworn testimony is that by 1978, the Jersey faction under Accetturo's command was generating revenue at a scale that placed it among the most profitable single units in the American Mafia, and almost no one outside the Bureau knew his name. There is a detail in the FBI files from this period that did not become public until much later. A man inside the Jersey crew, whose identity remains protected in court records, began cooperating with federal investigators in 1977. He provided information for nearly 15 years before his role was disclosed. He sat in meetings, he delivered envelopes, he drove men to sit-downs, and he reported everything he saw to a federal handler. Accetturo never identified him. Investigators who later reviewed the case described what they found as more deliberate than anyone had realized at the time. The Bureau had a window into the Jersey faction for almost the entire length of its operation. The reason no indictment landed for so long was not lack of evidence. It was strategy. The Bureau was waiting for the structure above. The headquarters of the most profitable arm of the Lucchese crime family was not a Manhattan penthouse. It was not a Brooklyn social club. It was an office above a strip mall in Livingston, New Jersey. Federal surveillance photographs from the late 1970s and early 1980s show a one-story commercial building. Fluorescent lighting visible through the front windows. A parking lot shared with a pizzeria and a dry cleaner. The men who came and went carried briefcases. They wore unremarkable clothes. They did not arrive in expensive cars. This was deliberate. Accetturo had given his deputies one operating principle, repeated by multiple cooperators in later testimony. Do not look like what you are. The Jersey faction did not run on one man. Beneath Accetturo, 3 names recurred in nearly every federal report. Michael Taccetta, a soldier turned acting captain, described in court documents as Accetturo's most trusted operational lieutenant. He handled the day-to-day administration of the crew when Accetturo was unavailable. Martin Taccetta, Michael's brother, who ran the loansharking and bookmaking operations. And Thomas Ricciardi, a younger soldier who would in time become the most consequential figure in the faction's collapse, Paul Umfersai. Though no one in the early 1980s could have predicted it. These 3 men, together with roughly 20 made members and a much larger network of associates, formed the operational core. A federal investigator who later testified before a Senate subcommittee on organized crime described the structure as follows. It was the most professionally organized faction we ever encountered. They kept records, they had territories, they had internal dispute resolution. It functioned like a corporation that had decided, for whatever reason, to be a criminal enterprise. The revenue streams were extensive. Illegal gambling, sports books and numbers operations across northern New Jersey. Generating, according to federal estimates entered into court records, in excess of $40 million per year by the mid-1980s. Loansharking, short-term, high-interest lending to gamblers, small business owners, and individuals who could not access conventional credit. The interest rates were measured in points per week. Labor racketeering, particularly in construction, where the faction held influence over several union locals and extracted payments from contractors in exchange for labor peace. Cargo theft, Newark Airport and the surrounding industrial corridors. Pharmaceuticals, electronics, clothing, anything that could be moved off a loading dock and resold through legitimate-seeming intermediaries. And then there was Florida. In the late 1970s, Accetturo began spending significant time in southern Florida. Federal records indicate he established a second base of operations in the Hollywood and Hallandale Beach areas of Broward County. He purchased property. He developed relationships with local figures. He extended the Jersey faction's gambling operations southward. The Florida expansion did two things. It diversified the revenue base, and it physically removed Accetturo from New Jersey for long stretches, making federal surveillance more complicated. The Bureau's response was to expand surveillance into Florida. The cooperator inside the Jersey crew, still unnamed in the public record, made the journey south with him. Numbers were extraordinary, but the men producing them were not, by any honest measure, free. Wiretap transcripts from this period, later entered into evidence, capture the texture of the life. Conversations clipped, paranoid, full of code words. Meetings held in cars, in parking lots, in walks along beaches because indoor spaces could not be trusted. Family relationships strained under the constant surveillance. Marriages collapsed. Children grew up under names that drew attention from teachers, neighbors, and law enforcement. One soldier in the Jersey faction, in a wiretapped conversation from 1983, said the following to another member: "We make more money than anyone. We can't spend any of it. I drive a 5-year-old car. I live in the same house I bought in '72. What is this?" The other man's response was not recorded clearly, but the question, "Qualo, what is this?" would echo through the next decade of the faction's history. By the mid-1980s, the Jersey faction had a reputation. Inside the family, they were considered the golden child, the crew that produced, the crew that did not embarrass the leadership, the crew that handled its own problems. Outside the family, in the broader landscape of American organized crime, they were a curiosity. In Manhattan, the leadership of the Lucchese family changed hands during these years. Old bosses died. New ones rose. Accetturo's relationship with each successive administration was conducted at a careful distance. He paid what he owed. He attended what he was required to attend. And he returned, as quickly as possible, to the strip mall in Livingston. In 1986, federal prosecutors in Newark began assembling a case. It would become the largest racketeering indictment in New Jersey history. It would name Accetturo, the Taccetta brothers, Ricciardi, and 17 other defendants. The prosecutors believed they had everything: the wiretaps, the cooperator, the financial records. What they did not have, what no one had, was a sense of how this particular jury was going to respond. Newark, New Jersey, 1986. The indictment ran to more than 70 counts: racketeering, conspiracy, gambling, loansharking, extortion, murder conspiracy. 21 defendants in total. The prosecution team described it to reporters as the most comprehensive case ever brought against an organized crime faction in the state. Accetturo was the lead defendant. Bail was set. Surrender dates were arranged. The defense team began its preparation. What followed was not a trial in the conventional sense. It was a marathon. Trial began in late 1986 and did not end until August of 1988. 21 months in a single courtroom. It became, at the time, the longest criminal trial in New Jersey history. Some sources describe it as the longest federal racketeering trial in American history to that point. The transcript ran to more than 40,000 pages. The jury heard from more than 80 government witnesses. They reviewed thousands of pages of financial records, hundreds of hours of wiretap recordings, and surveillance photographs covering nearly a decade. And at the end of it, in August of 1988, the jury returned its verdict: not guilty. On all counts. For all 21 defendants, the acquittal was, by almost any standard, an extraordinary outcome. In the days that followed, prosecutors spoke to reporters in terms that ranged from disbelief to resignation. The defense team gave press conferences. The defendants left the courthouse and returned to their lives in northern New Jersey. The press coverage was extensive. The New York Times described the verdict as a stunning rebuke to the federal racketeering strategy. The Star-Ledger called it a courtroom catastrophe. Inside the Jersey faction, the verdict was received with what cooperators later described as a strange combination of relief and unease. Relief, because they had walked free. Unease, because the trial had taken almost 2 years of their lives, exposed their operations in extraordinary detail, and made every man in the courtroom permanently aware of who they were. The myth of invincibility grew. The reality, in private, was that something had shifted. The legal acquittal did not change the underlying facts. The Jersey faction was still under federal surveillance. The cooperator was still embedded inside it. The financial records still existed. The wiretap recordings still existed. What the verdict had established was not innocence. It was the difficulty of obtaining a conviction with the case as constructed. Federal prosecutors began almost immediately to think about how a second case might be built. They had learned, in 21 months of trial, exactly which elements of their evidence had failed to persuade the jury. They had learned which witnesses had been effective and which had not. They began rebuilding. The Jersey faction, meanwhile, returned to business. But in Manhattan, the verdict raised a different question. The Lucchese family had a new leadership. Vittorio Amuso had taken over as boss in the mid-1980s, with Anthony Casso as his underboss. Both men came from a different tradition within the family, more violent, more centralized, less tolerant of regional autonomy. Jersey faction's 21-month acquittal had made them, in the eyes of the public, the most prominent and most successful crew in the family. It had also made them, in the private calculations of the new administration in Manhattan, a problem. A capo who could not be convicted by the federal government had a kind of independent authority, and the new administration was deeply interested in routing everything through Manhattan. In early 1989, according to testimony later given by Thomas Riccardi and others, Amuso and Casso summoned Accetturo to a meeting. The exact location is disputed in court records. Some accounts place it in Brooklyn, others in Manhattan. What is not disputed is the substance. The Manhattan leadership demanded an increased percentage of the Jersey faction's earnings. Cooperators who later testified about the meeting characterized the demand in different ways. Some described it as a routine tribute adjustment. Others described it as a deliberate provocation. A demand the new administration knew Accetturo would refuse. Either way, Accetturo refused. He returned to New Jersey. He gathered his deputies, and he told them, according to testimony later given under oath, that the Manhattan administration could not be trusted. The accounts from that period do not agree on the exact words he used, but the substance survived. What Accetturo could not have known in that meeting with his deputies was how quickly the situation would deteriorate. Within months, Amuso and Casso would begin compiling a list. Names of men inside the Lucchese family they considered disloyal. Men who had refused orders. Men who had failed to deliver tribute. Men whose independent authority they wanted dissolved. The bodies would begin to appear before the year was out. Federal investigators who later interviewed cooperators from this period described what they called, in internal documents, simply the list. It was not a formal document. It was a verbal directive that circulated through the Lucchese family between 1989 and 1991. Men were marked. The exact number of names varies depending on which cooperator testified. Some accounts say 9, others say more than 30. What is documented is that between 1990 and 1991, multiple Lucchese family members and associates were killed under circumstances that prosecutors later attributed directly to Amuso and Casso's directives. The Jersey faction was specifically targeted. Anthony DeLappi, a Lucchese capo who had moved to California, was killed in a Los Angeles parking garage in February of 1990. Bruno Faxiolo, a soldier suspected of cooperating with federal authorities, was killed in Brooklyn in August of that same year. His body was found in the trunk of a car with a canary placed inside his mouth. A deliberate signal, prosecutors later argued, of the offense the leadership believed he had committed. In New Jersey, Michael Papadio, an associate connected to the Jersey faction, disappeared. The pattern was clear. What was less clear to the men inside the Jersey faction was how far up the list their own names were. In the early months of 1991, the men around Accetturo began to make decisions. Some left the country, some went into hiding, and some began quietly to consider the one option that 30 years of code had told them was unthinkable: cooperation with the federal government. Thomas Riccardi was the first. He approached federal authorities in early 1991. He offered to testify against members of his own faction, against the Manhattan leadership, against the structure he had spent his adult life inside. His reasoning, as later described in court documents, was straightforward. He believed he was on the list. He believed his death was a matter of months, possibly weeks. He chose to live. Riccardi's decision triggered what federal prosecutors later described as the most significant cascade of cooperators in the history of the New Jersey Mafia. Michael Taccetta did not cooperate. He chose to fight the charges that followed. Martin Taccetta did not cooperate, but others did. Soldiers who had spent decades inside the faction came forward. Associates who had handled money, driven men to meetings, sat in on conversations, Nick Nine, they came forward. The structure that Accetturo had built, the disciplined, deliberate, exceptionally cautious organization, began to collapse from the inside. And Accetturo himself, in 1993, after his own arrest on new charges and after confirmation that his name was on the list, made the decision that no one in the New Jersey Mafia had ever expected him to make. He agreed to cooperate. The man who had run the most profitable arm of the Lucchese crime family for almost 20 years. The man who had walked out of a Newark courtroom in 1988, acquitted on all counts. That man was now sitting in a federal facility, in protective custody, giving the United States government a complete accounting of everything he had built. His reasons, in the limited public statements he made over the following decades, were consistent. The leadership in Manhattan had broken the contract. They had marked his men for death. They had violated the principle that had governed the structure since its founding. He owed them nothing. In late 1993, Vittorio Amuso was convicted in federal court and sentenced to life in prison. Anthony Casso was arrested in 1993. He would eventually cooperate as well, though his cooperation was later terminated after federal authorities determined he had committed additional crimes while in custody. The men who had compiled the list became, themselves, the subjects of federal prosecutions that would consume the rest of their lives. But the structure they had threatened, the Jersey faction, was already gone. Lake Success, New York. 1994. Anthony Accetturo took the witness stand and began to testify. The format was familiar to federal prosecutors. He answered questions. He identified men he had known for decades. He described meetings, transactions, hierarchies, decisions. His testimony was not a single revelation. It was a long, patient administrative dismantling of a structure he had once built. Cases that resulted from Accetturo's cooperation and the cooperation of others from the Jersey faction ran for years. Michael Taccetta was convicted in 1993 on racketeering and murder conspiracy charges. He was sentenced to life in prison. Martin Taccetta was convicted on related charges. His sentence ran to multiple decades. Numerous soldiers and associates received sentences ranging from years to life. The empire was gone. Accetturo's own sentence reflected the value of his cooperation. He had faced what federal prosecutors initially indicated would be a life sentence. After his testimony, his sentence was reduced substantially. He served additional time in federal protective custody. He was eventually released. He entered witness protection. He died in 2019 at the age of 81. The obituary in the Star-Ledger was brief. What is harder to document, and what the historical record only partially captures, is the cost to the people around him. His wife, his children, the extended family that had grown up under his name in northern New Jersey. Witness protection requires the abandonment of identity. New names, new locations, new histories. For some family members, the transition was accepted. For others, it was not. Court records and reporting indicate that the family's relationships became, in the years after his cooperation, fragmented in ways that were never publicly resolved. The man who had built an empire to provide for his family had, in the end, traded that empire for the right to keep them alive. But at the cost of every continuity they had known. What the files do not show is almost as significant as what they do. A former federal prosecutor who worked on the New Jersey cases in the 1990s offered the following assessment in an interview given for an academic study of the period. If you measure success in the Mafia by money cargo, which is how they measured it, Intumac was the most successful capo of his generation. He just wasn't the most famous, and in his world, those two things were not the same. The Lucchese family did not collapse. It contracted. It reorganized. It survived. By the early 2000s, federal investigators were tracking a substantially reduced organization. Fewer made members, smaller territories, less revenue. The New Jersey faction, as a distinct organizational entity with operational autonomy, did not return. In the public memory of the American Mafia, Accetturo occupies an unusual position. He is not unknown. His name appears in academic studies, in federal court documents, in retrospective journalism about the era. But he is not famous in the way that John Gotti was famous. The discipline that had made him effective as a capo, the avoidance of publicity, the refusal of interviews, the deliberate suppression of personal celebrity, made him, in retrospect, almost invisible. The strangest part of this record is not what he did. It is how thoroughly he succeeded in being overlooked while doing it. The federal files generated by the investigation of the Jersey faction remain, in part, sealed. Some elements have been released through court proceedings, through Freedom of Information requests, through academic research. But significant portions remain classified or restricted. The cooperator from the early years, the man who had operated inside the Jersey crew for nearly 15 years before his role was disclosed, has never been publicly identified. The documents that survive tell only part of the story. What did Anthony Accetturo build? In one sense, the answer is straightforward. He built an organization that generated, by federal estimates, several $100 million in revenue over its operational lifetime. He survived the longest criminal trial in New Jersey history. He died in his 80s, in his own bed, of natural causes. In another sense, the answer is more difficult. The men he was responsible for received sentences that consumed the remainder of their lives. He outlived almost everyone he had worked with. The cost of that outliving is not measured in the federal documents. In a federal surveillance photograph from the late 1980s, Harlem, one of the few in which Accetturo appears clearly. He is leaving the Livingston office building. He is wearing a dark overcoat. He is carrying a folded newspaper. He is walking toward a car parked in the strip mall lot. He is not looking at the camera. He almost certainly does not know it is there. The photograph captures what he was for most of his career. A man walking out of a building no one was watching, to a car no one would remember, to a meeting no one would record. For almost 20 years, that invisibility was his greatest professional asset. For the last 25 years of his life, in witness protection, it became his only one. The account that has been presented here draws from federal trial transcripts, sworn testimony, declassified FBI surveillance files, court documents, and contemporary reporting in the New York Times, the Star-Ledger, the Asbury Park Press, and academic studies of the period. Some details remain contested. Where the historical record is incomplete, or where witnesses disagreed under oath, that uncertainty has been noted. What is remarkable about the Lucchese family's New Jersey operation is not that it existed. The American Mafia operated regional factions for most of the 20th century. What is remarkable is how well it worked. For almost 20 years, in plain view of federal investigators, the most profitable arm of one of the five families was run from a strip mall in suburban New Jersey by a man whose face almost no one outside law enforcement could have identified. And then it ended. Not because the federal government finally broke through, but because the leadership above made a decision that the man at the center of it could not accept. He chose his life over the structure. The structure was already finished. He merely confirmed it. The strip mall in Livingston no longer houses the office. The Garden State Parkway still runs through the territory the faction once controlled. The construction projects along it are now overseen by different authorities. The men who worked under Accetturo are by now mostly dead. Some died in prison. Some died after release, in their 70s and 80s, in homes their illegal earnings had paid for decades earlier. Some, like the man they had answered to, died under names that the federal government will not release. The institution they built has been studied, prosecuted, and written about. But it is not bumpy amneen, in any meaningful sense, remembered. There is a final detail in the federal record that is worth observing. In the years after his cooperation, Accetturo gave a small number of interviews. Most were to academic researchers studying organized crime. The interviews were brief. He answered some questions. He declined others. In one of them, conducted in the early 2000s, he was asked what he believed his legacy would be. The answer, as transcribed in the academic study where it appeared, was a single sentence. He said, "Unquote Niem, I made a lot of money, and I gave it all back." End quote. The interviewer asked him to clarify. He did not. The man who had built the most profitable arm of the Lucchese crime family, who had survived its longest trial and its deadliest internal purge, who had outlived almost everyone he had worked with, sat in a small room in an undisclosed location and gave the only answer he was prepared to give. Then he stopped speaking, and the record on him closes.